The morning air at Denver's Centennial Airport carried the crisp bite of October, thin and sharp at 5,800 feet above sea level. Beyond the gleaming glass facade of Elite Sky Charter's executive terminal, the Rocky Mountains rose like sentinels against a pale blue sky. It was the kind of morning that promised clarity, the kind that made million-dollar decisions feel inevitable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Washington stepped out of his midnight black Tesla Model S Plaid, the soft hum of the electric motor fading into silence as he pressed the key fob. His Italian leather briefcase caught the early sunlight, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the sprawling private aviation facility before him. At 38, Elena carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built something from nothing and then built it again, bigger. The charcoal Tom Ford suit he wore was tailored to perfection, cut to accommodate his 6'2" frame without a wrinkle out of place. His Oxford dress shoes clicked rhythmically against the polished concrete as he approached the terminal entrance. Everything about his appearance spoke of success, from the platinum Patek Philippe watch on his wrist to the subtle cologne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But success, Elena had learned long ago, was not always protection. He paused for a moment outside the entrance, checking his phone one final time. 3 missed calls from his CFO, 2 from his head of operations, and a string of text messages that all carried the same urgent undertone. The Seattle deal was falling apart. The investors were getting cold feet. The merger that had taken 18 months to negotiate was crumbling by the hour, and he needed to be in that boardroom by noon Pacific time. Elite Sky Charter had been recommended by his assistant as the premier private aviation service in Denver. Their fleet boasted everything from light jets to heavy cabin aircraft, and their reputation for discretion and efficiency had made them the go-to choice for Fortune 500 executives across the Rocky Mountain region. The company's marketing materials promised seamless luxury for the discerning traveler and white-glove service that anticipates your every need. Elena had specifically requested a Gulfstream G650, capable of making the Denver to Seattle route in just over 2 hours. The aircraft rental alone would cost $47,000 for the round trip, a sum he authorized without hesitation. Time was worth more than money when a $2 billion acquisition hung in the balance. The terminal's interior was a study in understated elegance. Cream-colored marble floors stretched beneath soaring ceilings supported by brushed steel beams. Comfortable seating areas were arranged around a central fireplace that crackled with real wood, not gas. The walls displayed photographs of mountain peaks and vintage aircraft, creating an atmosphere that was both sophisticated and approachable. Behind the reception desk sat a young woman with carefully styled blonde hair and a smile that seemed practiced rather than genuine. Her name tag read Madison Cooper, and she wore the navy blue blazer that marked her as Elite Sky Charter staff. She looked up as Elena approached, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly as she took in his appearance. "Good morning," Elena said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to being heard. "I have a charter scheduled for 8:30, Washington, Gulfstream to Seattle." Madison's fingers moved across her keyboard, the clicking sound echoing in the quiet terminal. Her brow furrowed slightly as she stared at her screen, then looked up at him with an expression that was harder to read than before. "I'm showing a reservation under that name," she said slowly, "but there seems to be some kind of ... discrepancy." Elena set his briefcase down beside the counter, his full attention now focused on the young woman before him. In his 15 years of building Washington Capital from a one-room office in Oakland to a private equity firm managing $8 billion in assets, he had developed an acute sensitivity to the subtle shifts in tone that preceded problems. "What kind of discrepancy?" he asked, Madison glanced around the terminal, as if checking to see who might be listening. The space was nearly empty, except for a maintenance worker polishing the marble floor. Near the far wall, and an older gentleman in pilot stripes reviewing paperwork at a corner table. "Well," she began, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, "it's just that we need to verify certain things before we can proceed with high-value charters." Elena's expression remained neutral, but something cold began to form in his chest. He had heard these words before, in different contexts, with different faces delivering them. The careful phrases that never quite said what they meant, the verbal dancing around truths that were too ugly to speak directly. "What exactly needs to be verified?" he asked, his tone still professional, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments before. Madison's smile became more strained. "Payment verification, identification, background screening. Standard procedures for new clients, you understand. Especially for clients who might be using the service for the first time." Elena reached into his jacket and withdrew a black American Express Centurion card, placing it deliberately on the marble counter. The card caught the morning light, its titanium surface unmarked by any visible spending limit. Beside it, he placed his driver's license and a business card embossed with the Washington Capitol logo. "Payment method," he said calmly. "Identification. Business credentials. Is there anything else you need to verify?" Madison picked up the cards, examining them with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for suspected forgeries. She held the Centurion card up to the light, as if checking for watermarks that didn't exist. Her eyes moved between the driver's license photo and Elena's face multiple times, comparing features that were obviously identical. "The thing is," she said finally, returning the cards to the counter but not sliding them back toward him, "we've had some issues lately with fraudulent reservations. People claiming to be someone they're not, using stolen cards, that sort of thing. Our insurance requires us to be extra careful." The maintenance worker had moved closer, his polishing motion slowing as he seemed to strain to hear the conversation. The pilot at the corner table had looked up from his paperwork, his attention now fixed on the exchange at the reception desk. Elena felt the familiar weight of recognition settling over him. This was not about payment verification or insurance requirements. This was about something else entirely. Something that had followed him from the housing projects of East Oakland to the boardrooms of San Francisco. Something that expensive suits and prestigious degrees and billion-dollar deals had never quite been able to erase. "I see," he said, his voice still level. "And how exactly do you propose to resolve these concerns?" Madison glanced toward a door marked Management behind the reception desk. "Let me get my supervisor. He'll be able to handle this more efficiently." As she disappeared through the door, Elena remained standing at the counter, his hands resting lightly on the marble surface. He checked his watch. 8:15. The Gulfstream should be fueled and ready for departure. His pilot's license was current, his charter agreement was signed, and his payment was guaranteed by one of the most exclusive credit cards in the world. But none of that seemed to matter. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the aircraft he had chartered sitting on the tarmac. The Gulfstream's white fuselage gleamed in the morning sun, its engines already warming up in preparation for departure. The sight of it filled him with a mixture of anticipation and growing frustration. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of footsteps on marble. He turned to see a man in his 50s approaching, wearing the same navy blazer as Madison, but with additional stripes on his sleeves that marked him as senior staff. The man's face was weathered in the way that suggested years of aviation experience, but his eyes held a wariness that had nothing to do with flying. "Mr. Washington," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Kellner, operations manager. I understand there might be some questions about your charter." Elena shook the offered hand, noting the firmness of the grip and the way Kellner's eyes studied his face with obvious assessment. I'm not aware of any questions, Elena replied. I made a reservation, I'm here on time, and I'm ready to depart. What seems to be the issue? Kellner glanced at Madison, who had returned to her position behind the counter, then back at Elena. Well, it's not exactly an issue. It's more a matter of protocol. Robert Kellner's definition of protocol unfolded like a slow-motion catastrophe. Each word carefully chosen to sound reasonable while systematically dismantling Elena's morning plans. The operations manager guided him to a private seating area near the fireplace, away from Madison's desk, but not beyond the curious gaze of the pilot who had abandoned all pretense of reviewing his paperwork. Coffee? Kellner offered, gesturing toward a sleek espresso machine that occupied a corner of the lounge area. We import our beans directly from a small farm in Guatemala. Most of our clients find it exceptional. Elena declined with a slight shake of his head. The offer felt performative, a social lubricant designed to smooth over whatever uncomfortable conversation was about to unfold. He remained standing while Kellner settled into one of the leather armchairs, creating a dynamic that immediately established who held the power in this exchange. Mr. Washington, Kellner began, his tone adopting the careful neutrality of someone delivering unwelcome news. Your reservation was processed through our standard booking system, but it triggered several flags in our security protocols. What kind of flags? Elena asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Kellner opened a tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be a detailed report. First-time client requesting our most expensive aircraft on short notice. Payment method that our system couldn't immediately verify through traditional channels. Flight planned to Seattle with same-day return, which fits the profile of certain activities that we're required to monitor. The euphemisms hung in the air like smoke. Elena had heard variations of this script before, in bank lobbies when he tried to make large cash deposits in his early entrepreneurial days, in luxury car dealerships when he expressed interest in purchasing vehicles that cost more than most, people's homes, in exclusive restaurants where hostesses suddenly discovered that all tables were reserved despite obvious vacancies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Activities, Elena repeated, the word carrying a weight that made Kellner shift uncomfortably in his chair. Drug trafficking, Kellner clarified, apparently deciding that directness was preferable to continue dancing around the subject. Money. Laundering. Illegal weapons transport. The D requires all charter companies to maintain vigilance regarding suspicious flight patterns. Elena reached into his briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio containing documents that few people outside the highest levels of corporate finance ever saw. Annual reports stamped with SEC filing numbers. Investment prospectuses bearing the signatures of institutional fund managers. Letters of credit from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. Bank statements showing account balances that would require scientific notation to express in full. My company manages $8 billion in institutional capital, he said, placing the portfolio on the coffee table between them. We have investments in everything from renewable energy infrastructure to biotechnology startups. Our most recent acquisition was a logistics company in Portland that employs 4,000 people. The reason I need to be in Seattle today is to prevent a $2 billion merger from collapsing due to last-minute investor concerns. Kellner examined the documents with the same suspicious intensity that Madison had applied to his credit card. He held pages up to the light, checked watermarks, compared signatures. Each gesture felt like an accusation wrapped in the veneer of due diligence. These look legitimate, Kellner admitted after several minutes of scrutiny. They are legitimate, Elena replied, his voice carrying the first hint of impatience. Just as my reservation is legitimate, my payment method is legitimate, and my need to be in Seattle in less than 3 hours is legitimate. Through the windows, Elena could see ground crew members beginning to service other aircraft on the tarmac. A smaller Learjet was being fueled at the adjacent gate, its passengers already aboard and visible through the cabin windows. They appeared to be a family of 4, all white, all dressed in casual vacation attire that suggested they were heading somewhere warm for a holiday weekend. The challenge, Kellner continued, setting the portfolio aside, is that our insurance company has specific requirements for high-value charters. They require additional verification steps for certain categories of clients. What categories? Elena asked, though the question felt rhetorical. Kellner's pause lasted just long enough to make his discomfort obvious. New clients without established relationships. Clients whose business activities might attract law enforcement attention. Clients who fit certain demographic profiles that our actuaries have identified as higher risk. The euphemism demographic profiles settled over the conversation like a shroud. Elena felt something fundamental shift inside him, not anger exactly, but a crystalline clarity that made every detail of the situation suddenly sharp and bright. The way Madison had examined his identification with extra scrutiny. The way Kellner kept glancing toward the management office as if seeking approval for his words. The way both of them seemed surprised that his documents were authentic. And what demographic profile do I fit? Elena asked. Kellner's face flushed slightly. I think you understand what I'm getting at. No, Elena said, his voice gaining an edge that cut through the terminal's ambient noise. I want you to say it explicitly. What demographic profile triggers these additional verification requirements? The pilot at the corner table had given up all pretense of working and was now openly listening to their conversation. Madison stood behind her desk, her attention fixed on the exchange despite having several other tasks she could have been performing. Even the maintenance worker had slowed his polishing to a near standstill. Look, Kellner said, lowering his voice and leaning forward in his chair. I'm not trying to make this difficult. I'm just following company policy. If you can provide additional documentation, references from other charter companies, maybe a letter from your bank confirming your financial status, we can probably work something out. Elena's phone buzzed with another text message from his CFO. The merger team was assembling in Seattle. The investors were demanding answers. The window for salvaging the deal was closing with each passing minute. How long would this additional verification process take? He asked. Usually 24 to 48 hours, Kellner replied. Sometimes longer if we need to contact references directly. The absurdity of the situation struck Elena with perfect clarity. He was being asked to wait up to 2 days to prove he was worthy of chartering an aircraft that he could afford to purchase outright. The verification process would take longer than the round trip to Seattle. By the time Elite Sky Charter finished confirming his legitimacy, the merger would be dead and buried. I see, Elena said, closing his briefcase with a decisive snap. And I assume this verification process applies to all your clients? Kellner's silence was answer enough. Elena stood, straightening his jacket with movements that had become automatic after decades of high-stakes meetings. Mr. Kellner, I want to make sure I understand the situation correctly. You're refusing to honor a confirmed reservation because you believe I might be involved in drug trafficking or money laundering, despite the fact that I've provided legitimate identification, valid payment, and extensive documentation of my business activities. We're not refusing, Kellner protested. We're just asking for additional. You're asking me to wait 2 days to prove I'm not a criminal, Elena interrupted. You're asking me to provide references like, I'm applying for a job rather than paying $47,000 for a service. You're treating me like a threat rather than a customer. The terminal had fallen completely silent except for the crackling of the fireplace and the distant sound of jet engines on the tarmac. Madison had stopped typing. The maintenance worker had abandoned his polishing entirely. The pilot was watching with undisguised fascination. Kellner stood as well, his height advantage negated by the obvious discomfort in his posture. I understand your frustration, but we have to follow protocol. If you'd like to speak with our owner, I can arrange a call. Who owns Elite Sky Charter? Elena asked. The company is privately held by the Morrison family, Kellner replied. Harold Morrison founded it in 1987. His son David runs day-to-day operations. Elena made a mental note of the names while maintaining his outward composure. And where might I find David Morrison this morning? He's actually in the building, Kellner said, glancing toward the management office. But he's in meetings all morning. I could ask his assistant to schedule something for later this week. No, Elena said quietly. That won't be necessary. He picked up his briefcase and walked back toward the reception desk, his footsteps echoing in the silent terminal. Madison looked up at him with an expression that mixed curiosity with concern, as if she sensed that something significant was about to happen but couldn't quite identify what. I'll need the contact information for your corporate headquarters, Elena told her. Legal department, specifically. Madison's fingers moved hesitantly over her keyboard. May I ask why you need? You may not, Elena replied, his tone leaving no room for discussion. She printed out a sheet containing addresses, phone numbers, and email contacts for Elite Sky Charter's various departments. Elena folded the paper carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. Will you be rescheduling your charter? She asked. Elena looked through the windows at the Gulfstream that should have been carrying him to Seattle. The ground crew had finished their preparations. The aircraft was ready for departure, waiting only for a passenger who would apparently never be allowed to board. No, he said. I don't think I'll be needing your services. As he walked toward the exit, Elena's phone rang. The display showed his assistant's number. Jennifer, he answered. Elena, thank God, came the voice of Jennifer Walsh, the most efficient human being he had ever employed. I've been trying to reach you. The Seattle situation is deteriorating. Rapidly, the investors are threatening to walk completely. You need to be in that conference room in 2 hours, or we're going to lose everything. Elena paused just outside the terminal doors, the crisp mountain air sharp against his face. Behind him, through the glass, he could see Kellner and Madison watching his departure with expressions that suggested they weren't entirely sure what had just transpired. Jennifer, he said, his voice calm despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. I need you to get Marcus Chun on the phone immediately. Marcus Chen was Washington Capital's head of mergers and acquisitions, a former Goldman Sachs partner who specialized in hostile takeovers and complex corporate restructuring. He was also one of the few people Elena trusted completely when speed and discretion were equally important. What should I tell him? Jennifer asked. Elena looked back at the terminal one final time, his gaze settling on the Gulfstream that sat tantalizingly close, yet completely out of reach. Tell him we're about to acquire an aviation company. The Tesla's interior provided a sanctuary of silence as Alana sat in the driver's seat, his phone pressed to his ear while the engine remained off. Through the windshield, he maintained a clear view of Elite Sky Charter's terminal, watching the subtle dance of activity that continued despite his departure. Ground crews moved between aircraft like worker ants, oblivious to the seismic shift that was about to reshape their professional landscape. Marcus Chun's voice carried the sharp efficiency of someone who had orchestrated billion-dollar acquisitions before breakfast. Elite Sky Charter, privately held, family-owned since 1987. He recited, his fingers clearly flying across a keyboard. Annual revenue approximately $47 million. Fleet of 18 aircraft ranging from light jets to heavy cabin. Clean. Financial statements, no major litigation, solid reputation in the Rocky Mountain region. How clean? Elena asked, adjusting his rearview mirror to keep the terminal entrance in view. Spotless, actually. Harold Morrison built a legitimate operation. Conservative growth, minimal debt, excellent safety record. They cater primarily to Fortune 500 executives and high net worth individuals. Exactly the kind of company that would never expect to become an acquisition target. Elena's mind began calculating trajectories and possibilities. Market valuation? Based on comparable sales in the private aviation sector, somewhere between 60 and 80 million. But here's the interesting part. They're not publicly traded, and there's no indication they've ever considered selling. This would have to be an unsolicited approach. Through the terminal windows, Elena could see Kellner speaking animatedly with someone just outside his field of vision. The operations manager's gestures suggested he was recounting recent events, possibly seeking guidance or approval for his handling of the situation. Madison remained at her desk, but her attention kept drifting toward the parking area where Elena's Tesla sat like a black chess piece, positioned for an unexpected move. "Marcus," Elena said, his voice carrying the weight of decision, "I want you to initiate contact with Morrison's legal team within the hour. Full acquisition proposal, cash offer, 60-day close." The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough for Marcus to process the implications, but not long enough to suggest hesitation. "What's the opening bid?" Elena watched a family of 4 emerge from the terminal and walk toward the Learjet he had observed earlier. Their casual comfort with the process was evident in every gesture. No additional verification required. Number. Suspicious examination of documents. No questions about demographic profiles or insurance concerns. 90 million, Elena said. Marcus's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the phone speaker. That's 15 to 20 million over market value. They'll think we're either desperate or crazy. Let them think whatever they want. Elena replied. But make it clear that this is a serious offer with immediate funding available. I want Harold Morrison to understand that someone with $90 million in cash is very interested in having a conversation about his company's future. Elena, Marcus said, his tone shifting to the careful cadence he used when questioning decisions that seemed driven by emotion rather than logic. I have to ask, is this about the Seattle merger? Because if that deal is falling apart, there might be less dramatic ways to secure alternative transportation. Elena's gaze shifted to the Gulfstream that should have been carrying him to Seattle. The aircraft represented more than transportation. It symbolized access, privilege, and the assumption that money could overcome any barrier. The fact that his money, substantial, legitimate, documented money, had been deemed insufficient to secure that access revealed something fundamental about the nature of barriers in American society. This isn't about transportation, Elena said. This is about sending a message. What kind of message? Elena's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Jennifer, his assistant. He switched to conference mode, bringing both of his most trusted advisors into the same conversation. Jennifer, you're on with Marcus. Status report. Jennifer's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. The Seattle investors are getting nervous. They're asking specific questions about your location and expected arrival time. I've bought us maybe another hour by telling them you're dealing with a flight delay, but they're starting to talk about postponing until Monday. Monday would kill the deal, Marcus observed. The market conditions that make this merger attractive are shifting daily. If we lose momentum now, it'll take months to rebuild confidence. Elena stepped out of the Tesla and began walking slowly around the vehicle, using movement to focus his thoughts. The morning air carried the sound of jet engines spinning up for departure, a reminder of the opportunities that were literally taking off while he remained grounded. Jennifer, I need you to coordinate with Marcus on something that's going to sound unusual, Elena said. We're about to make an acquisition. Offer for Elite Sky Charter. I want it done fast, clean, and with enough legal pressure to ensure they take it seriously. The charter company that just refused your flight? Jennifer asked, her voice revealing both surprise and a hint of admiration. "Are you buying them out of spite?" "I'm buying them out of necessity," Elena corrected. "But if spite happens to be a motivating factor, I'm comfortable with that moral complexity." Marcus cleared his throat, a sound that usually preceded important tactical observations. "Elena, there's something you should know about timing. Morrison's father, Harold, is scheduled for retirement at the end of this fiscal year. David Morrison, the son, has been gradually taking over operations. This could actually be perfect timing for a family looking to liquidate their assets. Or it could be terrible timing for a family trying to maintain control of their legacy business," Jennifer countered. "We need to approach this carefully." Through the terminal windows, Elena saw a new figure emerge from the management office, a man in his 40s wearing an expensive suit that suggested executive authority. The newcomer's conversation with Kellner was animated but brief, ending with both men looking in the direction of Elena's vehicle. "I think David Morrison just became aware of our morning's interaction," Elena observed. "Marcus, how quickly? Can you have legal documents prepared for an initial offer?" 2 hours if I pull everyone off their current projects." "But Elena, we should discuss strategy. Are you planning to approach this as a friendly acquisition, or—" "There's nothing friendly about what happened in that terminal," Elena interrupted. "But the offer itself will be professional and generous. I want Morrison to understand that this is business, not personal revenge." Jennifer's voice carried a note of concern. "What exactly happened there?" Elena recounted the morning's events in precise detail, from Madison's initial hesitation to Kellner's explicit mention of demographic profiles and drug trafficking concerns. As he spoke, he watched David Morrison exit the terminal and begin walking purposefully toward the parking area. "Jesus," Jennifer said when he finished. "They profiled you based on race and then tried to cover it with security protocols. And now they're about to discover what happens when you apply those protocols to someone with the resources to buy your entire company," Marcus added, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who appreciated elegant symmetry. David Morrison had reached the edge of the parking area and was clearly searching for Elena's vehicle. His expression suggested someone trying to decide between damage control and aggressive confrontation. "He's coming this way," Elena said. "Marcus, I want that offer in Morrison's hands before close of business today. Jennifer, get our legal team prepared for due diligence. And both of you should understand, this isn't a negotiation. This is a demonstration." "A demonstration of what?" Jennifer asked. Elena ended the call without answering and slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. David Morrison had spotted the Tesla and was approaching with the determined stride of someone who believed he could still control the narrative of the morning's events. Morrison was younger than Elena had expected, probably in his early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of tan that suggested frequent travel to sunny destinations. His suit was well-tailored, but not exceptional, suggesting someone comfortable with wealth, but not ostentatious about displaying it. When he reached the Tesla, he knocked softly on the driver's side window. Elena lowered the window but remained seated, creating a dynamic that forced Morrison to lean down slightly to make eye contact. "Mr. Washington," Morrison said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone attempting diplomacy. "I'm David Morrison, owner of Elite Sky Charter. I understand there was some confusion about your reservation this morning." "No confusion," Elena replied calmly. "Your staff made their position quite clear." Morrison glanced back toward the terminal, where Kellner and Madison were visible through the windows, both watching the parking lot conversation with obvious anxiety. "I'd like to invite you back inside so we can resolve this situation," Morrison continued. "I'm sure we can arrange your charter to Seattle with minimal delay." Elena studied Morrison's face, looking for signs of genuine contrition versus damage control. What he saw was a businessman who had suddenly realized that refusing service to the wrong customer could have consequences beyond a negative Yelp review. "What's changed?" Elena asked. Morrison's pause was brief but telling. "I've reviewed your documentation personally. Everything appears to be in order." Everything was in order an hour ago when your operations manager was explaining demographic profiles and insurance requirements, Elena pointed out. "Has your insurance policy changed in the last 60 minutes? The question hung in the air between them, highlighting the logical inconsistencies in Elite Sky Charter's shifting position. Morrison's discomfort was visible in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Look," Morrison said, abandoning the diplomatic approach, "maybe Kellner was overly cautious. We've had some issues lately with fraudulent bookings, and he might have applied our security protocols too broadly. I can personally authorize your charter right now." Elena started the Tesla's engine, the electric motor's silent activation causing Morrison to step back slightly. "Mr. Morrison," Elena said, "in about an hour, you're going to receive a very generous offer to purchase your company. I suggest you take it seriously." Morrison's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that your business model apparently includes discriminating against customers based on their appearance rather than their ability to pay," Elena replied. "I'm talking about the market value of companies that engage in such practices. You can't be serious about buying our company because of a booking misunderstanding," Morrison said, his voice rising slightly. Elena put the Tesla in reverse, forcing Morrison to step further away from the vehicle. Through the passenger window, he could see more staff members gathering in the terminal, their attention focused on the parking lot drama unfolding outside their workplace. "Mr. Morrison," Elena said, 47 minutes ago, your company had a customer willing to pay $47,000 for a charter flight. Now you have a potential acquirer offering $90 million for your entire operation. I'll let you decide which represents the better business opportunity." As Elena backed out of the parking space, Morrison stood frozen, his mind clearly racing to process the implications of what he had just heard. The morning had begun with a routine charter refusal based on unconscious bias and corporate policy. It was about to end with a complete transformation of Elite Sky Charter's ownership structure. The demonstration was just beginning. The conference room at Washington Capital's Denver satellite office occupied the entire 32nd floor of a gleaming downtown skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering an unobstructed view of the Rocky Mountains. Elena had never intended to use this space for anything more significant than quarterly regional meetings, but circumstances had transformed it into the war room for the most audacious acquisition of his career. 3 hours had passed since his departure from Elite Sky Charter. The Seattle merger had been postponed indefinitely, costing Washington Capital an estimated $40 million in potential returns. But Elena's attention was no longer focused on Seattle. It was concentrated entirely on the stack of legal documents spread across the mahogany conference table and the phone call that would determine whether Elite Sky Charter remained an independent family business or became a wholly owned subsidiary of Washington Capital. Marcus Cheen sat at one end of the table, his laptop displaying real-time financial data, while 3 separate phones maintained open lines to attorneys, accountants, and aviation industry specialists. Jennifer Walsh occupied the opposite end, coordinating communications with a precision that would have impressed military logistics officers. Between them, a team of 6 specialists worked with the focused intensity of surgeons performing a complex operation. "Morrison's attorney just received our formal offer," Marcus announced, ending a call with their lead counsel. $90 million cash, 60-day close, full due diligence rights, retention of all current staff with improved benefits packages. What was his immediate response? Elena asked, loosening his tie but maintaining the crisp professionalism that had carried him through 15 years of high-stakes negotiations. Shocked silence, followed by a request for 24 hours to review, Marcus replied. But their attorney did ask one specific question, whether this offer was connected to any service disputes from this morning. Jennifer looked up from her phone, where she had been monitoring social media and industry forums for any mention of the morning's events. There's already chatter in private aviation circles. Someone posted on Aviation Pros about a misunderstanding at Elite Sky Charter, involving a high-profile client. No names mentioned yet, but the story is spreading. Elena walked to the windows, his reflection ghost-like against the afternoon sky. Denver stretched below him like a detailed map, the airport visible as a geometric pattern of runways and terminals in the distance. Somewhere in that sprawl, David Morrison was probably sitting in his own conference room, trying to comprehend how a routine morning had evolved into an existential threat to his family's business. "Marcus, what's our maximum exposure if they reject the offer?" Elena asked. "Legal fees, due diligence costs, maybe $200,000 total," Marcus replied. "But Elena, I have to say, their finances are even better than we initially thought. Elite Sky Charter is genuinely profitable, well-managed, and positioned for growth. If we acquire them, it won't be a revenge purchase. It'll be a smart investment. And if we don't acquire them," Marcus consulted his notes, "they continue operating as before, potentially with improved discrimination training and revised booking protocols. Your $47,000 gets refunded. Life goes on." Elena turned back to the room, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that had driven every major success in his career. "That's not acceptable." "Which part?" Jennifer asked. "The part where life goes on as before," Elena replied. "The part where a company can profile customers based on race, refuse service based on demographic concerns, and then continue operating without consequences. The part where the next black executive who tries to charter their aircraft faces the same suspicious questions and verification requirements." His phone rang with a call from an unknown Denver number. Elena answered immediately, suspecting the caller's identity. "Mr. Washington, this is Harold Morrison," came the voice of an older man speaking with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to authority. "I believe you've made an offer to purchase my company." "Mr. Morrison," Elena replied, activating the speakerphone so his team could hear the conversation. "Thank you for calling. I assume you've had time to review our proposal." "I have," Harold said. "And I have to say, I'm confused about your motivation. Elite Sky Charter has never been for sale. We've built this business over 35 years. And it's been our intention to pass it down to the next generation." Elena's team maintained perfect silence, understanding that this conversation would determine the trajectory of the entire acquisition. "Mr. Morrison," Elena said, "your intention to maintain family control is admirable. However, this morning's events have raised serious concerns about your company's operational policies and customer service standards." "My son explained what happened," Harold replied, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "It sounds like there was a misunderstanding about security protocols. These things happen in the post-9/11 aviation environment." "These things happen to specific types of customers," Elena corrected. "I'm curious, how many white customers have been asked to provide additional verification due to demographic profiling concerns?" The silence that followed lasted long enough for Marcus to check his watch and Jennifer to exchange meaningful glances with the other team members. "Mr. Washington," Harold said finally, "I think you're making assumptions about our policies that aren't supported by facts." "Then let's discuss facts," Elena replied, his voice gaining the precision that had made him legendary in corporate negotiations. "Fact 1. I made a legitimate reservation for a charter flight. Fact 2. Your staff examined my identification with unusual scrutiny. Fact 3. Your operations manager explicitly mentioned demographic profiles as a factor in Your verification requirements. Fact 4. When I asked for clarification, he stated that certain categories of clients trigger additional security measures. Those are your interpretations of a customer service interaction, Harold responded. We have protocols that apply. To all new customers, Mr. Morrison, Elena interrupted. I've been chartering private aircraft for over a decade. I've used services in New York, Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, and London. I've never once been asked to provide references like a job applicant. I've never been told that my payment method needed verification beyond standard credit card processing. I've never been informed that my flight plans fit suspicious activity profiles. Marcus slid a tablet across the table displaying Elite Sky Charter's customer database. The information had been compiled during their rapid due diligence process, revealing patterns that supported Elena's assertions. Furthermore, Elena continued, consulting the data, your customer demographics are revealing. In the past 12 months, Elite Sky Charter has served approximately 240 individual clients. Of those, fewer than 12 appear to be Black or Hispanic, despite serving a metropolitan area with significant minority populations. Either your marketing is remarkably ineffective at reaching diverse customers, or your service standards create barriers that discourage repeat business. Harold's breathing was audible through the phone speaker, suggesting someone processing information that contradicted comfortable assumptions about his company's operations. Are you suggesting that Elite Sky Charter deliberately discriminates against minority customers? Harold asked. I'm suggesting that intent is less important than impact, Elena replied. Whether your policies are deliberately discriminatory or unintentionally exclusionary, the result is the same. Customers who don't fit certain demographic expectations face additional scrutiny, delays, and barriers to service. Jennifer held up her phone, displaying a message that had just arrived from their legal team. Elena read it quickly and nodded. Mr. Morrison, Elena said, I'm going to make our position very clear. Washington Capital is prepared to purchase Elite Sky Charter for $90 million cash, with closing within 60 days. This offer includes retention of all current employees, improvement of benefits packages, and implementation of comprehensive bias training programs. And if we decline? Harold asked. If you decline, we'll respect your decision and withdraw our offer, Elena replied. However, I want you to understand something important. This morning's events will not remain private. The aviation industry is small, and word travels quickly. Other potential customers will hear about demographic profiling and verification requirements. They'll make their own decisions about whether to trust Elite Sky Charter with their business. Marcus pulled up another screen displaying Elite Sky Charter's customer retention rates and revenue projections. The data painted a picture of a company vulnerable to reputation damage and competitive pressure. Additionally, Elena continued, Washington Capital will be entering the private aviation market regardless of your decision. If we don't acquire Elite Sky Charter, we'll establish our own operation with a clear commitment to serving all customers with equal dignity and respect. The Rocky Mountain region is large enough for competition. The threat was polite, but unmistakable. Harold Morrison was being offered a choice between selling his company for a premium price or watching it compete against a well-funded rival with superior customer service standards. I need to discuss this with my family, Harold said finally. Of course, Elena replied. But I want to be clear about the timing. This offer expires at 5 p.m. today. If we don't have an agreement by then, Washington Capital will pursue alternative strategies for entering the private aviation market. That's less than 3 hours, Harold protested. That's longer than your staff gave me to prove I wasn't a drug dealer. Elena replied calmly. The line went quiet for several seconds before Harold spoke again, his voice carrying a different tone, the sound of someone who had finally grasped the full scope of the situation. Mr. Washington, Harold said, If we were to accept your offer, what assurances do we have that you wouldn't simply liquidate our assets or eliminate our staff? You have my word, Elena replied, backed by contractual guarantees that your attorneys can review. Washington Capital doesn't acquire companies to destroy them. We acquire them to improve them. And the current management structure? Your son David would retain operational authority under new ownership, assuming he's committed to implementing the cultural changes necessary to ensure this morning's events never happen again. Harold's sigh was audible through the speaker. I built this company to serve people, Mr. Washington. If our policies have created barriers for legitimate customers, that's not the legacy I want to leave. Then help us build a better legacy, Elena said. Sell us Elite Sky Charter, and let's transform it into a company that serves everyone with the respect they deserve. The silence that followed felt different from the defensive pauses earlier in the conversation. This was the sound of a decision being weighed, of a family legacy being balanced against moral clarity. I'll call you back within 2 hours, Harold said finally. I'll be waiting, Elena replied. As the call ended, the conference room erupted in controlled celebration. Marcus pumped his fist, Jennifer smiled for the first time all day, and the legal team began preparing closing documents. But Elena remained focused on the windows, watching afternoon shadows stretch across Denver. The confrontation was over, but the real work was just beginning. At 4:47 p.m. Mountain Time, Harold Morrison's voice came through the conference room, speakers with the weight of 3 decades worth of family legacy behind every word. The tension in Washington Capital's makeshift war room was palpable as team members leaned forward, legal documents at the ready, calculators displaying final figures, and laptops streaming real-time market data. Mr. Washington, Harold began, his voice steadier than it had been during their previous conversation. After extensive discussion with my family and legal advisors, we've decided to accept your offer. The room erupted in silent celebration. Fist pumps, broad smiles, and exchanged glances of disbelief and triumph. But Elena maintained his poker face, knowing that the announcement was only the beginning of what would prove to be the most complex acquisition of his career. I'm pleased to hear that, Mr. Morrison, Elena replied, his voice betraying none of the satisfaction coursing through him. Our legal team is prepared to begin the closing process immediately. There are conditions, Harold continued, and the room's energy shifted back to focused attention. First, David remains as operational director with full authority over day-to-day management. Second, we retain our current staff with guarantees of employment security for a minimum 2 years. Third, the Elite Sky Charter name and branding remain unchanged. Marcus was already taking notes, his financial calculator working overtime to assess the implications of each condition. Jennifer monitored 3 different phone lines while simultaneously coordinating with their banking partners to ensure the $90 million transfer could be completed within the accelerated timeline. Acceptable on all counts, Elena agreed. However, I have my own conditions. All staff undergo comprehensive bias training within 90 days. Customer service protocols are completely rewritten with input from diversity and inclusion specialists. And we establish a customer feedback system with independent oversight to ensure service quality remains consistent across all demographic groups. Agreed, Harold said, though his voice carried the resignation of someone who understood that his family's control over their legacy business had just ended forever. Marcus slid a tablet across the conference table, displaying the final acquisition timeline. Due diligence would be completed by Friday, legal documents finalized over the weekend, and ownership transfer concluded by the following Tuesday. It was an aggressive schedule that would require round-the-clock work from attorneys, accountants, and regulatory specialists. Mr. Morrison, Elena said, I want you to understand something important. This acquisition isn't punishment for this morning's events. It's an opportunity to demonstrate what elite customer service, Actually looks like when it's applied equally to everyone who can afford it. I hope you're right, Harold replied. Because 35 years of building something can be undone very quickly if the new direction doesn't work. The call ended with formal pleasantries, but the weight of what had just transpired settled over the conference room like morning fog. In less than 8 hours, a routine charter flight refusal had escalated into a complete change of corporate ownership. The morning's discrimination had triggered an afternoon's acquisition. Jennifer's phone rang, immediately with the first of what would become dozens of media inquiries. The aviation industry's rumor mill had been churning since the morning's events, and news of Washington Capital's acquisition was spreading through professional networks with the speed of wildfire. Aviation Weekly wants an exclusive interview, Jennifer announced. Bloomberg is asking for comments on the acquisition price. And something called the Private Jet Report is requesting details about the operational changes you're planning. No interviews today, Elena decided. Standard press release announcing the acquisition, emphasizing our commitment to excellence and customer service. Nothing specific about this morning's events, unless directly asked. Marcus looked up from his laptop, where he had been monitoring real-time reactions from industry forums and social media platforms. The response is interesting. Half the comments are calling this the most expensive customer service complaint in aviation history. The other half are applauding you for putting your money where your principles are. What about Elite Sky Charter's existing customers? Elena asked. Mixed reactions, Marcus replied, scrolling through a private aviation customer forum. Some are expressing concern about service changes under new ownership. Others are saying they've noticed Elite Sky Charter's staff being selective about their customer service standards and that new management might be exactly what the company needs. Jennifer held up her phone, displaying a text message that had just arrived from David Morrison. He wants to meet with you this evening to discuss the transition process. He's requesting a face-to-face conversation about maintaining service quality during the ownership change. Elena checked his watch. The day had been so intense that he had lost track of time entirely. The morning felt like it had happened weeks ago, yet the acquisition documents bearing his signature were still warm from the printer. Set it up for 7 p.m. at Elite Sky Charter, Elena decided. Neutral territory. He needs to understand that this transition is going to be collaborative, not adversarial. Are you sure that's wise? Marcus asked. Going back there today might seem like gloating. Or it might seem like leadership, Elena countered. David Morrison is about to become my operational director. He needs to see that I'm serious about making this partnership work. As the legal team packed up their documents and prepared to begin the marathon closing process, Elena's phone buzzed with a call from an unexpected source. The display showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code indicated someone calling from Seattle. Mr. Washington, came the voice of someone he had never spoken to but immediately recognized from countless conference calls. This is Richard Thornton from Pacific Northwest Ventures. I believe you were supposed to be in our offices this morning. Richard. Thornton was the lead investor whose concerns about the merger had triggered Elena's urgent need to be in Seattle. The fact that he was calling directly suggested that the morning's missed meeting had created ripple effects far beyond the immediate financial implications. Mr. Thornton, Elena replied, activating the speakerphone for his team's benefit. I apologize for my absence. There were unexpected circumstances that prevented my travel. So I've heard, Thornton said, his voice carrying an amusement that suggested he was already aware of the morning's developments. Word travels fast in our industry. Mr. Washington, I'm calling because I wanted to discuss something that might surprise you. Marcus and Jennifer exchanged glances, neither sure whether this conversation would bring good news or additional complications. The merger that we were supposed to discuss this morning, Thornton continued, was contingent on your personal involvement and leadership. When you didn't appear, Several of our partners began questioning whether Washington Capital was genuinely committed to the partnership. I understand their concerns, Elena replied carefully. But then we started hearing stories about your activities in Denver, Thornton said. Stories about a $90 million acquisition completed in a single afternoon. Stories about a company that discovered what happens when they underestimate your resources and determination. The conference room fell silent as Elena's team realized that the Seattle merger might not be as dead as they had assumed. Mr. Thornton, Elena said, I'm not sure I understand where this conversation is heading. It's heading toward a revised offer, Thornton replied. Our partners have spent the afternoon discussing your response to this morning's situation. The consensus is that someone who can acquire an entire company in retaliation for poor customer service is exactly the kind of decisive leader we want as a partner. Jennifer's eyes widened as she realized that Elena's most expensive customer service complaint in history had somehow transformed into his most effective business development strategy. The merger terms we discussed yesterday are still available. Thornton continued, with one modification. We're increasing the partnership stake by 15% and adding a premium for what our board is calling demonstrated leadership under pressure. Marcus was frantically calculating numbers on his tablet, trying to determine the financial implications of Thornton's revised offer. The figures that appeared on his screen were large enough to make him blink twice to ensure he hadn't misplaced a decimal point. That's a substantial change from our original discussions, Elena observed. Substantial situations require substantial responses, Thornton replied. Your acquisition of Elite Sky Charter demonstrates exactly the kind of strategic thinking and rapid execution that makes successful partnerships possible. The irony was almost overwhelming. The morning's discrimination had cost Elena the Seattle meeting, potentially destroying a $2 billion merger. But his response to that discrimination had impressed the Seattle investors enough to improve the merger terms beyond their original scope. Mr. Thornton, Elena said, I'll need to review the revised terms with my team before making any commitments, of course. But Mr. Washington, I want you to know something. The Aviation acquisition isn't being viewed as an impulsive reaction. It's being viewed as a masterclass in turning obstacles into opportunities. After ending the call with Thornton, the conference room buzzed with renewed energy. What had begun as the worst business day in recent memory was transforming into one of the most profitable afternoons in Washington Capital's history. Let me get this straight, Marcus said, reviewing his calculations. Elite Sky Charter refused your service this morning. You responded by acquiring their company for $90 million. The Seattle investors heard about the acquisition, decided you're exactly the kind of leader they want to partner with, and improved their merger offer by an amount that more than covers the acquisition cost. That's an accurate summary, Elena confirmed. So basically, Jennifer added, Elite Sky Charter's discrimination policy just funded its own takeover and generated a profit in the process. Elena loosened his tie completely and allowed himself the first genuine smile of the day. The morning's humiliation had been transformed into an afternoon's triumph, but more importantly, it had created an opportunity to ensure that future customers would never face the same barriers he had encountered. Marcus, he said, I want you to begin developing diversity and inclusion standards that go beyond basic compliance. I want Elite Sky Charter to become the gold standard for equitable service in the private aviation industry. And the Seattle merger? Jennifer asked. We'll review Thornton's revised terms tomorrow, Elena decided. Tonight, I have a meeting with my new operational director to discuss how we're going to transform a family business into an industry leader. As the team prepared to leave the conference room, Elena remained at the windows, watching Denver's skyline transition from afternoon light to evening shadows. Somewhere in that urban sprawl, Elite Sky Charter's staff was probably processing the news that their company had been sold. Their policies had been challenged, and their future was now tied to the vision of the customer they had turned away. That morning, the ripple effects were just beginning to spread. The Elite Sky Charter Terminal looked different at 7 o'clock in the evening. The morning's bustling activity had given way to a quieter atmosphere, with only essential staff remaining to handle late arrivals and overnight aircraft maintenance. The same marble floors that had witnessed the morning's confrontation now reflected the warm glow of sunset streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, creating an almost cathedral-like ambiance that seemed appropriate for what was essentially a corporate resurrection. David Morrison stood near the reception desk where Madison Cooper had questioned Elena's credentials 12 hours earlier. The young woman had left for the day, but her supervisor had briefed Morrison on the staff's growing awareness that their new owner was the same customer they had turned away that morning. The irony was not lost on anyone, and Morrison could feel the weight of uncertain stares from employees who were trying to process how dramatically their professional landscape had shifted. When Elena entered the terminal, he carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had characterized his morning arrival, but now there was an additional layer of authority that came from ownership rather than mere customer status. He wore the same charcoal suit, though he had replaced his tie with an open collar that suggested someone prepared for honest conversation rather than formal negotiation. "Mr. Washington," Morrison said, extending his hand with a firmness that suggested respect rather than the defensive posture that had marked their parking lot encounter. "Thank you for coming back." "Mr. Morrison," Elena replied, accepting the handshake while maintaining direct eye contact. "I thought it was important that we establish the foundation for our working relationship as quickly as possible." Morrison gestured toward the private seating area near the fireplace, the same location where Kellner had attempted to explain demographic profiling protocols that morning. The symbolism was deliberate. Both men understood that this conversation would determine whether the day's events represented an ending or a beginning. "Before we discuss operational details," Morrison said as they settled into the leather chairs, "I want to apologize for what happened this morning. Not just as a business necessity, but because it was wrong." Elena studied Morrison's expression, looking for signs of genuine contrition versus calculated damage control. What he saw was someone wrestling with uncomfortable truths about his company's culture and his own role in perpetuating systems he had never consciously examined. "Apologies are important," Elena replied, "but they're less important than understanding. Do you understand why this morning's events were problematic?" Morrison paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I understand that our security protocols created barriers that disproportionately affected certain customers. I understand that what we called standard procedures weren't actually applied in a standard way." "And why weren't they applied in a standard way?" Elena pressed. "Because," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition, "our staff made assumptions based on appearance rather than documentation. They saw a successful black man in first-class surroundings and decided that additional verification was needed. The honesty was uncomfortable but necessary." Morrison was acknowledging not just policy failures, but the underlying biases that had made those failures possible. "David," Elena said, using his first name to signal a shift toward collaborative discussion, "I want you to understand something important. This acquisition isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about transformation. Elite Sky Charter has the infrastructure, reputation, and staff expertise to become a leader in equitable customer service. But that requires acknowledging that excellence isn't just about aircraft maintenance and flight safety." Through the terminal windows they could see ground crews preparing aircraft for evening departures. The same Gulfstream that Elena had been denied access to that morning was being fueled for another charter, its white fuselage gleaming under the airport's floodlights. "What specific changes are you envisioning?" Morrison asked. Elena withdrew a tablet from his briefcase, and opened a presentation that his team had prepared during the afternoon's acquisition planning. The first slide displayed Elite Sky Charter's customer demographics, revealing patterns that supported his morning's observations about service disparities. Comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff, Elena began, scrolling through. Detailed implementation plans. Standardized booking and verification procedures that apply equally to all customers, regardless of demographic characteristics. Customer feedback systems with independent oversight to identify service inconsistencies before they become systemic problems. Morrison reviewed the data with a growing understanding of how his company's practices had created invisible barriers for potential customers. The numbers were stark. Elite Sky Charter's customer base was significantly less diverse than the demographics of their service region, suggesting that their marketing reach or service standards were somehow excluding entire populations. "This is more extensive than I expected," Morrison admitted. "Excellence requires intention," Elena replied. "You can't accidentally create an inclusive culture any more than you can accidentally maintain aircraft safety standards. Both require deliberate systems, consistent training, and ongoing measurement." Morrison's phone buzzed with a text message from Robert Kellner, who had apparently heard about the ownership change and was requesting an emergency meeting. Morrison showed the message to Elena, who nodded his approval for the operations managers. Inclusion in their discussion. When Kellner arrived 10 minutes later, his discomfort was immediately apparent. The man who had confidently explained demographic profiling protocols that morning now moved with the uncertain gait of someone whose professional world had been completely reorganized. "Mr. Washington," Kellner said, his voice carrying none of the authoritative tone that had characterized their morning interaction. "I understand congratulations are in order on your acquisition." "Thank you," Elena replied without offering the social lubricant that might have eased Kellner's obvious anxiety. "Robert, I wanted you to join this conversation because you'll be instrumental in implementing the operational changes we're planning." Kellner took a seat across from both men, his posture suggesting someone preparing for termination rather than collaboration. "This morning," Elena continued, "you explained that Elite Sky Charter's insurance requirements included additional verification for certain demographic profiles. I want you to contact your insurance provider tomorrow and request specific documentation of those requirements." "Sir?" Kellner asked, clearly confused by the direction of the conversation. "I want written confirmation from your insurance company that they require racial profiling as part of their coverage terms," Elena clarified. "Because if such requirements exist, we'll need a new insurance provider. And if they don't exist, we'll need new operational protocols." The implications settled over Kellner like a weight. He was being asked to prove that his morning's explanations had been based on actual policy rather than personal bias, and all three men understood that such proof would be impossible to produce. "Mr. Washington," Kellner said slowly, "I may have overstated the insurance requirements. Security protocols are somewhat discretionary." "Discretionary," Elena repeated, allowing the word to hang in the air. "Robert, discretionary protocols that are applied based on customer appearance aren't security measures. They're discrimination policies." Morrison watched the exchange with growing awareness of how his company's culture had operated beneath his conscious attention. Kellner's admission revealed that the morning's verification requirements had been personal judgment disguised as corporate policy. "What I'm proposing," Elena continued, "is that we eliminate discretionary protocols entirely. Every customer receives the same verification process, the same level of service, and the same respect regardless of what they look like or what assumptions staff members might make about their background." "That makes sense," Morrison agreed, then turned to Kellner. "Robert, I want you to work with Mr. Washington's team to develop new standard operating procedures. No more discretionary anything. Clear protocols that apply to everyone. Kellner nodded with the enthusiasm of someone grateful to still have employment, but his expression suggested genuine commitment to the changes being proposed. "There's something else," Elena said, consulting his tablet again. "I want Elite Sky Charter to become a case study in how aviation companies can serve diverse clientele effectively. We're going to document our transformation process and share best practices with other companies in the industry." The scope of Elena's vision was becoming clear. This wasn't just about correcting one company's discriminatory practices. It was about establishing new industry standards that could prevent similar incidents throughout the private aviation sector. "Mr. Washington," Morrison said, "that level of transparency might expose us to criticism from competitors who prefer current industry practices." "David," Elena replied, "our competitors can choose to improve their practices or explain to customers why they haven't. Either way, Elite Sky Charter benefits from being perceived as the industry leader in equitable service." Morrison's phone rang with a call from his father, Harold, who had apparently been monitoring industry forums where news of the acquisition was generating intense discussion. Morrison answered the speaker at Elena's suggestion. "David," Harold's voice carried a mixture of relief and apprehension, "I've been reading reactions to the sale. The feedback is complex." "What kind of reactions?" Morrison asked. "Some customers are expressing concern about service changes under new ownership," Harold replied. "But others are saying they've had similar experiences with our staff, and that new management might address long-standing issues." The revelation that other customers had experienced similar treatment suggested that the morning's events were symptomatic of broader cultural problems rather than isolated incidents. "Dad," Morrison said, "Mr. Washington has outlined comprehensive changes that will improve service quality for all our customers. I think you'll be impressed with his vision for the company." "I hope so," Harold replied, "because 35 years of reputation can be enhanced or destroyed depending on how well this transition is managed." After ending the call, the three men spent another hour developing implementation timelines for the operational changes. Bias training would begin within 2 weeks. New customer service protocols would be finalized within 30 days. Independent customer feedback systems would be operational within 60 days. By the time their meeting concluded, Elite Sky Charter's transformation had evolved from abstract concept to concrete action plan. The company that had discriminated against Elena that morning would become a model for inclusive excellence in the private aviation industry. As they prepared to leave the terminal, Morrison extended his hand again to Elena. "Mr. Washington, I want you to know that I'm genuinely excited about the changes we're implementing. This morning was a wake-up call that our company needed." "David," Elena replied, "the best apology for past mistakes is future excellence. Let's build something that makes discrimination impossible rather than just unlikely." Walking toward the parking area under Denver's star-filled sky, Elena reflected on how completely the day's trajectory had shifted. The morning's humiliation had become the afternoon's opportunity, and the evening's conversation had established foundations for systematic change that would extend far beyond Elite Sky Charter's operations. The transformation was no longer theoretical. It was operational, measurable, and began immediately. 6 months later, the Elite Sky Charter terminal looked exactly the same and completely different. The marble floors still gleamed under morning sunlight, the fireplace still crackled with real wood, and the mountain views still took visitors' breath away. But the invisible barriers that had once made the space unwelcoming to certain customers had been systematically dismantled and replaced with something unprecedented in the private aviation industry. Eleanor Washington stood at the same reception desk where Madison Cooper had questioned his credentials, but now the young woman behind the counter wore a new kind of confidence. Her name tag still read Madison Cooper, but her training manual had been completely rewritten, her protocols standardized beyond discretionary interpretation, and her understanding of customer service transformed through months of comprehensive education. "Good morning, Mr. Washington," Madison said with genuine warmth. "Your aircraft is ready for departure. Captain Martinez completed the pre-flight inspection, and we've loaded the catering preferences you requested." The interaction was seamless, professional, and identical to what any customer would receive regardless of their appearance, background, or demographic profile. But more importantly, it represented the culmination of the most comprehensive transformation in Elite Sky Charter's 35-year history. Elena's morning charter to Seattle had become a weekly routine since the Pacific Northwest merger had been finalized with terms even more favorable than Richard Thornton's revised offer. The partnership had generated returns that made the Elite Sky Charter acquisition look like a rounding error. But the strategic value of owning a discrimination-free aviation company had proven even more significant than the financial benefits. "Mr. Washington," came a familiar voice from behind him. "Do you have a few minutes before your departure?" Elena turned to see David Morrison approaching with a tablet displaying what appeared to be quarterly performance metrics. In the 6 months since the acquisition, Morrison had transformed from defensive family business protector to passionate advocate for inclusive excellence, and his leadership had been instrumental in Elite Sky Charter's cultural evolution. "What's the report, David?" Elena asked, accepting the tablet and scrolling through data that told a remarkable story of organizational change. "Customer satisfaction scores have increased 18%. Morrison began, his voice carrying pride that would have been impossible to imagine during their first confrontation. "Customer diversity has increased 43%. And most importantly, we haven't had a single discrimination complaint since the new protocols were implemented." The numbers represented more than statistical improvement. They documented the systematic elimination of barriers that had previously made Elite Sky Charter services inaccessible to entire demographic groups. But the transformation extended far beyond internal operations. "The industry impact has been even more significant," Morrison continued, switching to a different screen displaying media coverage and competitor responses. 7 other private aviation companies have contacted us requesting consultation on bias training programs. The Aviation Diversity Council has invited you to keynote their annual conference. And somehow, we've become the company that other executives specifically request when they need charter services. The irony was perfect. Elite Sky Charter's reputation for discriminatory practices had been replaced by a reputation for inclusive excellence, creating a competitive advantage that generated both moral satisfaction and financial returns. Through the terminal windows, Elena could see the same Gulfstream that had been denied to him 6 months earlier. But now the aircraft bore new significance. It represented not just transportation, but transformation. Every flight carried the message that excellence in customer service meant treating all customers with equal dignity and respect. "David," Elena said, "I want you to see something." He opened his own tablet and displayed customer feedback data that his team had been collecting since the acquisition. The comments revealed the personal impact of Elite Sky Charter's cultural changes on individual travelers who had previously felt unwelcome in private aviation environments. "This is my favorite," Elena said, highlighting a review from Dr. Patricia Williams, a prominent surgeon from Atlanta. She wrote, "For the first time in my professional career, I chartered a private aircraft without being questioned about my qualifications, my payment method, or my right to be there. Elite Sky Charter treated me like what I am, a customer who can afford their services." Morrison read through additional reviews, each telling similar stories of professionals who had experienced seamless service after years of facing suspicion and additional verification requirements with other aviation companies. "There's something else you should know," Morrison said, switching to a screen displaying Elite Sky Charter's financial performance. "Revenue has increased 28% since the acquisition. It turns out that treating all customers with respect is actually good business. The financial success validated Alina's belief that inclusive practices weren't just morally necessary, they were economically advantageous. Companies that eliminated discriminatory barriers didn't just serve existing markets more effectively. They accessed entirely new customer segments that had previously been excluded. Mr. Washington, Morrison continued, I've been thinking about expansion possibilities. The model we've developed here could be replicated in other markets. Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago markets where private aviation companies might benefit from comprehensive diversity and inclusion programs. Alina's vision had always extended beyond Elite Sky Charter's operations. The acquisition had been designed to demonstrate that discriminatory practices were business liabilities rather than necessary evils, and that companies willing to embrace inclusive excellence could achieve competitive advantages that benefited everyone involved. Actually, David, Alina said, I've been having similar thoughts. Washington Capital is considering establishing an investment fund specifically focused on acquiring companies with discriminatory practices and transforming them into industry leaders in inclusive service. The scope of the proposal was ambitious, using private equity resources to systematically eliminate discrimination across multiple industries by demonstrating that inclusive practices generated superior financial returns. A discrimination to excellence fund, Morrison mused. That's brilliant. And Elite Sky Charter becomes the proof of concept. Exactly, Alina confirmed. We've demonstrated that a $90 million investment in eliminating discrimination can generate returns that exceed traditional acquisition strategies. Now we scale that model across other industries where similar barriers exist. Morrison's excitement was evident in his rapid-fire questions about implementation possibilities. Hotels that profiled guests, restaurants that provided inferior service to certain demographic groups, retail establishments that followed customers based on appearance rather than behavior. The potential applications were numerous and profitable. The fund would target companies with documented discrimination issues, Alina explained. Acquire them at premium prices that reflect their cultural liabilities, implement comprehensive transformation programs, and generate returns through improved customer satisfaction and expanded market access. But the conversation was interrupted by an announcement that Alina's flight was ready for departure. Captain Martinez, Elite Sky Charter's first Hispanic pilot, promoted to Chief Aviation Officer under the new ownership structure, was waiting to brief him on the flight plan to Seattle. As they walked toward the aircraft, Morrison reflected on how completely his perspective had changed since that confrontational morning 6 months earlier. Mr. Washington, I want you to know that this acquisition saved our company in ways that go beyond financial considerations. We were becoming irrelevant without realizing it. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's a business strategy that guarantees decline. David, Alina replied, the most expensive mistake any business can make is assuming that discrimination is profitable. It isn't. It's just profitable for companies that avoid examining their practices closely enough to recognize the customers they're losing. The Gulfstream's interior reflected the same attention to detail that had always characterized Elite Sky Charter services. But now that excellence was available to everyone who could afford it, rather than just customers who met certain demographic expectations. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Alina reflected on the journey that had begun with morning humiliation and evolved into systematic transformation. The Seattle merger had been completed successfully, generating returns that made the Elite Sky Charter acquisition profitable within the first quarter. But more importantly, the cultural changes had created a model for inclusive excellence that was being studied and replicated throughout the private aviation industry. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Chen, who had been developing investment strategies for the Discrimination to Excellence Fund. The preliminary research had identified potential acquisition targets in hospitality, Retail and professional services companies whose discriminatory practices created both moral imperatives and business opportunities for intervention. Elite. Sky Charter's transformation metrics are attracting attention from institutional investors, Marcus had written. 3 major pension funds have inquired about participating in the Discrimination to Excellence Fund. They're interested in investments that generate both financial returns and social impact. The validation from institutional investors confirmed that Elena's approach was being recognized as innovative rather than impulsive. The morning's discrimination had catalyzed the development of an entirely new investment strategy that could generate systemic change across multiple industries. As the Gulfstream reached cruising altitude, Elena opened his laptop and began drafting a speech for the Aviation Diversity Council conference. The keynote would focus on the business case for inclusive excellence, using Elite Sky Charter's transformation as evidence that discrimination was a correctable business liability rather than an inevitable social problem. Excellence isn't accidental, he wrote. It requires intention, investment, and accountability. Companies that treat discrimination as an acceptable cost of doing business are choosing to limit their potential rather than expand their possibilities. The speech would challenge industry leaders to examine their own practices and consider whether their customer service standards were creating barriers that limited market access and revenue potential. But more importantly, it would demonstrate that alternatives were available for companies willing to invest in transformation. Through the aircraft's windows, the Rocky Mountains passed below like a geographic reminder of the obstacles that could be overcome with sufficient determination and resources. 6 months earlier, those same mountains had provided the backdrop for discrimination and humiliation. Now they symbolized the heights that could be achieved when barriers were systematically eliminated rather than reluctantly tolerated. The flight to Seattle would take 2 hours, giving Elena time to complete his conference speech and review expansion plans for the Discrimination to Excellence Fund. But he already knew the speech's conclusion, the message that would challenge every audience member to examine their own role in perpetuating or eliminating discriminatory practices. Change is not charity, he would tell the Aviation Diversity Council. Change is competition. Companies that embrace inclusive excellence don't just serve their communities better, they serve their shareholders better. The choice isn't between profits and principles. The choice is between short-term comfort and long-term success. The message was simple but revolutionary. Discrimination was not just morally wrong, it was economically inefficient. Companies willing to eliminate discriminatory barriers would access markets, talent, and opportunities that remained unavailable to competitors who maintained exclusive practices. As the Gulfstream began its descent into Seattle, Elena smiled at the recognition that his morning humiliation had become an afternoon transformation that was evolving into a lifetime mission. Elite Sky Charter's acquisition had demonstrated that discriminatory practices could be eliminated profitably and systematically. The demonstration was complete. The revolution was just beginning. And every future customer who walked into Elite Sky Charter's terminal would experience the excellence that should have been available all along: service based on ability to pay rather than appearance, respect based on humanity rather than demographics, and dignity as the foundation of every interaction. The sky, it turned out, truly was the limit when barriers were removed rather than reinforced. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.